The letter was still warm from his hands when Frances Thatcher pulled it from beneath the rotting floorboard, and the moment she unfolded it, the entire world she thought she understood came apart at the seams. But that was getting ahead of things. The story of Frances Thatcher and Gilbert Whitfield did not begin with that letter, though it ended with it. Or rather, it ended with what came after. It began in the autumn of 1882, in the dust-blown town of Calla Creek, Texas, where the wind came down off the plains like it had a grudge, and the sun set in colors so violent they looked like something out of the book of Revelation. Frances had arrived in Calla Creek on the 2nd of October, 1882, aboard the Southern Pacific's Daily Mail wagon, which was not technically a passenger service, but had agreed to take her as far as the territorial line for $3, and a promise she would not complain about the smell of the mail sacks. She did not complain. She had not had much to say at all since leaving her father's house in San Antonio, not after the argument that had preceded her departure, not after the door had been shut behind her with a finality that felt more like a burial than a goodbye. She was 24 years old, brown-haired, with eyes the color of good creek water and a jaw that her mother, God rest her, had once called stubborn enough to break stone. She carried a carpetbag and a small trunk that contained everything she owned, which was not much. A good dress for Sundays, 2 working dresses, one of which was already patched at the elbow, a sewing kit, her mother's Bible, a folded newspaper advertisement she had answered 6 weeks prior, offering the position of schoolteacher in the town of Calla Creek, Texas. Salary $12 per month, accommodation provided. The accommodation, as it turned out, was the back room of the general store owned by a widow named Edith Pruitt, who was 60 years old and ran her establishment with the kind of firm, cheerful authority that made you feel simultaneously welcomed and evaluated. Edith looked Frances up and down when she arrived, then handed her a key and a plate of cornbread, and that was that. The schoolhouse itself was a one-room affair at the edge of town, between the livery stable and a dry creek bed, with 11 students ranging in age from 6 to 14, and a stovepipe that leaked smoke when the wind blew from the northwest. Frances loved it almost immediately. She loved the way the children came in every morning with their faces freshly scrubbed and their hair damp, loved the smell of chalk and pine desks, loved the silence that fell when she opened a book and began to read aloud. Teaching, she had learned long ago, was the one thing she was good at that did not require anyone's permission. She had been in Calla Creek exactly 4 days when she first saw Gilbert Whitfield. He was standing outside the livery stable with a horse that was not cooperating, a big roan gelding named Caesar who had, according to the livery boy Tommy Pruitt, a habit of planting all 4 feet when he did not want to move and becoming, in that moment, essentially immovable. Gilbert had one hand on the bridle and was speaking to the animal in a low, even voice that carried no impatience whatsoever, which struck Frances as unusual, because she had already observed that men in Calla Creek did not generally speak to anything without some measure of frustration. The town had a hard edge to it, the kind that came from too much wind and too little water, and too many years of fighting the land for every inch of progress. Gilbert Whitfield was 30 years old, tall and lean in the way that working men are lean, with dark hair that needed cutting and hands that were rough from the particular combination of carpentry and ranch labor that constituted his livelihood. He owned 40 acres on the north edge of the Calla Creek territory, a modest spread with a house he had built himself over the course of 3 years, a barn that was newer and better constructed than the house, and enough cattle to keep him solvent if the rains came when they were supposed to. He also took carpentry work in town when it was available, which was how he came to be known to most of the families in Calla Creek as the man you called when something needed building or fixing. He was reliable. He was quiet. He was, by his own estimation and the estimation of most people who knew him, not the kind of man who was particularly interesting. Frances did not think he was uninteresting. She thought he was strange in the way that genuinely quiet men are strange, as though they are conducting some enormous interior conversation that no one else can hear. She noticed the way he finally got the horse moving by simply walking in the direction he wanted to go and trusting the animal to follow, which it did, and she thought there was something instructive in that approach that she could not quite articulate. She might have thought nothing more of it, except that 2 days later she discovered that her schoolhouse needed a new window frame. The existing one had warped so badly over the previous summer that it could no longer be opened without risk of the glass falling out entirely, and with winter coming, that was not acceptable. Edith Prout, who knew everyone in Calla Creek and their capabilities, told her without hesitation to speak to Gilbert Whitfield. Frances found him at his workshop behind the livery, which he rented from a man named Hector Vance for $2 a month, and the occasional help with loading and unloading freight. He was planing a length of pine when she arrived, the long, smooth strokes of the plane sending up curls of pale wood, and he did not hear her come in over the sound of his work, so she had a moment to observe him before he turned. When he turned, he looked surprised in a way that suggested he was not accustomed to visitors. He set down the plane and pushed the hair out of his eyes with the back of his wrist. "Miss," he said, which was how men in Calla Creek addressed women they did not know. "Frances Thatcher," she said, and held out her hand the way a man would because she had found it unsettled people who needed unsettling and reassured people who needed reassuring, and she could not yet tell which category Gilbert Whitfield fell into. The new schoolteacher. He shook her hand. His grip was careful, like he was worried about the difference in their strength. "Gilbert Whitfield," he said. "What can I do for you?" She told him about the window. He asked if he could come by and look at it, and she said yes, and he came that same afternoon, and the whole business of measuring and assessing took perhaps 20 minutes, during which they spoke perhaps 40 words to each other, none of which were personal. He told her he could have the new frame in by Friday. She thanked him. He nodded and left. That should have been the end of it, and for a few days it was. He came on Friday, as promised, with the new frame already cut and fitted, and he worked efficiently and without fuss, and Frances graded papers at her desk while he worked because she had no reason not to. The children were gone for the day. The schoolhouse was quiet except for the sound of his tools. Occasionally one of the students would pass by outside and peer through the old window at her, and she would wave them on. "You've built a lot around town," she said at one point, not because she needed to make conversation but because the silence had become the kind she felt she ought to acknowledge. "Some," he said from outside the window where he was fitting the new frame. "The Prout porch, yes. The church steps, yes." She looked up from her papers. "What about the building you're proudest of?" There was a pause. She thought maybe he was not going to answer, and she had already decided that was all right because some questions were not meant to produce answers so much as they were meant to produce the thinking. "My house," he said finally. "I built it myself, took 3 years. And you're proud of it." Another pause. "I'm proud that it stands." She thought about that for a while. "That seems like enough," she said. He came back in through the door to collect his tools, and as he did he glanced at her in the way of a man reassessing something he thought he had already assessed. "It's level," he said, about the window. "Should open and close clean. The glass will hold through winter." "Thank you, Mr. Whitfield." "Gilbert," he said, and then seemed to realize he had said it, and his expression shifted very slightly in a way that was not quite embarrassment but was adjacent to it. "If you prefer." "Gilbert, then," she said. "Thank you." He left, and she sat in the schoolhouse for a while after he was gone, looking at the new window frame, which was excellent work, straight and true, and she thought about a man who built things that stood and was proud of that and nothing more, and she thought that she understood something about him that she could not yet name. The town of Calla Creek in 1882 was the kind of place that operated on the assumption that everyone's business was everyone else's business, which meant that by the following Monday it was known throughout the settlement that the new schoolteacher had hired Gilbert Whitfield to fix her window, and that he had done so, and that they had spoken. This was reported to Frances by Edith Prout over breakfast, with the casual precision of a woman who considered information to be a currency as valuable as coin. "He's a good man," Edith said in the tone of someone delivering a verdict. "Keeps to himself too much, but that's grief for you." Frances looked up from her coffee. "Grief." Edith poured more coffee from the pot with the same unhurried manner she applied to everything. "His wife, Clara, she died 3 years back, fever. They'd been married 2 years, had a little girl who died the same winter." She set the pot down. "He built that house for them, finished it the spring after they were gone." Frances thought of what Gilbert had said. "I'm proud that it stands." She put her coffee cup down and was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know," she said. "No reason you would," Edith said. "But now you do." It was not pity she felt precisely. Frances had little patience for pity as an emotion because she had been on the receiving end of it too often in her life, and had found it more paralyzing than helpful. What she felt was something closer to recognition, the specific comprehension that comes from understanding why a person is the way they are, and she turned it over in her mind for several days without doing anything with it. October deepened into something genuinely cold. The stove in the schoolhouse earned its keep, and Frances learned to arrive early enough to have it going before the first students appeared, stamping their feet on the threshold. The children of Calla Creek were, by and large, a good-natured and industrious group, with a few exceptions, notably the Harmon boys, who were 8 and 10 respectively, and had worked out between them a system for cheating at arithmetic that Frances spent 3 days dismantling with something approaching professional admiration. She saw Gilbert Whitfield in town with some regularity, because Calla Creek was not a large place, and Gilbert came in for supplies and occasional work the way everyone did. He had a habit of touching the brim of his hat when he passed her on the street, a small formal gesture that she returned with a nod, and occasionally they exchanged a word or two, usually about the weather, occasionally about town matters. It was during one of these exchanges in mid-October, outside the general store, that something shifted. She had been carrying a crate of school supplies from Edith's wagon, which was heavier than it looked, and Gilbert had appeared beside her without announcement and taken the other handle of the crate without being asked, and they had carried it inside together with no particular conversation, and then he had tipped his hat and gone, and what stayed with Frances afterward was not the act of assistance itself, which was ordinary enough, but the quality of it. He had not made a ceremony of it. He had not looked at her afterward to see whether she was suitably grateful. He had simply done it and left, as though it had not occurred to him that it required acknowledgement. She mentioned this to Edith that evening, somewhat obliquely, saying only that she found Gilbert Whitfield to be unusually unassuming for a man in this country. Edith laughed, which was a full and genuine sound. "He's not unassuming," she said. "He's careful. There's a difference. Careful men don't throw themselves into things until they're sure of the ground." Frances thought about that for a long time that night, lying in her narrow bed in the back room of the store, listening to the wind work at the eaves. She thought about careful men and what it meant to be sure of the ground, and she thought about her own history, which was not particularly romantic, having involved a man in San Antonio who had been charming and effortless and ultimately less reliable than the weather, and she thought that perhaps careful was not the worst thing in the world. November came in wet, which was unusual and welcome, and then turned sharp and cold, which was neither unusual nor welcome but was expected. The first snow of the season fell on the 14th of November, a thin sifting of white that the wind took off the ground almost as fast as it came down, leaving the landscape looking indecisive, neither fully itself nor fully transformed. It was on that day that Frances made the decision to accept the invitation to supper at the Connolly house. The Connollys were the wealthiest family in Calla Creek, such as wealth existed in that part of Texas in 1882, which meant they had a proper dining room and a cook named Mrs. Olathe, who made biscuits that could convince you that existence was worthwhile. Robert Connolly was the man who owned the largest ranch in the territory, some 1,200 acres, and his wife Margaret was a woman of opinions who expressed them freely and without apology, which Frances had decided she liked. The supper included most of the leading citizens of Calla Creek, and as it turned out, Gilbert Whitfield, who had recently finished building a new addition to the Connolly barn and was apparently being rewarded with dinner, though he looked like a man who would have preferred to be rewarded with solitude. He was seated across the table from Frances, which meant she could watch him without appearing to, which she did. He spoke when spoken to, and what he said was thoughtful and direct, without embellishment. When Robert Connolly began talking about a land dispute with a neighboring rancher, Gilbert listened carefully and then offered a single observation about the legal precedents involved that made Connolly stop and reconsider his position entirely. Frances watched this and thought that she was looking at a man who was much more intelligent than his quietness allowed him to seem, and the recognition of this pleased her in a way that she found difficult to account for. After supper, the men went to the parlor and the women went to the sitting room, as was the custom of the time and place, and Frances sat with Margaret Connolly and 3 other women, one of whom spent the entire time talking about the price of calico, and another of whom asked Frances 3 times whether she found Calla Creek lonely, to which Frances gave the same answer each time, which was that she found it no lonelier than anywhere else she had been, which was honest if not entirely satisfying to the questioner. Margaret Connolly, who missed nothing, looked at Frances with a certain directness over her teacup. "You were watching Gilbert Whitfield all through dinner," she said, in a tone that was not accusatory but was certainly observant. Frances did not deny it. "He's interesting," she said. "Most people aren't," Margaret smiled. "No," she said, "most people aren't." She set her cup down. "He's been alone a long time, since Clara." "I know," Frances said. "He's not unhappy," Margaret said, and there was something deliberate in the way she said it, as though she were drawing a distinction. "He's just become accustomed to smallness, small life, small days. He needs something to pull him out of it." Frances felt the implication settle and did not reach for it, because she was not in the habit of reaching for things that were being implied at her. "I'm only the schoolteacher," she said. "That's what Clara was," Margaret said, "before she married him." Frances looked at her. Margaret looked back, entirely unabashed, and then the conversation moved on to other things, but the information sat in Frances's chest all the way home, a small and complicated weight. She had been in Calla Creek 2 months when she encountered the incident that changed the nature of what was between her and Gilbert Whitfield, though she would not have been able to say, even afterward, exactly what it changed it into. It was a Thursday, the first week of December, and she was walking back from the schoolhouse in the early dusk of winter when she came upon Tommy Prout, who was 14 and one of her better students, sitting at the edge of the dry creek bed with a gash on his forearm that was bleeding in a way that suggested it needed attention sooner rather than later. He had fallen from a fence he should not have been climbing, and the rusted wire had done its work. She knelt beside him and looked at the wound and told him with professional calm that it was going to be fine, and pressed her handkerchief against it and looked up to find Gilbert Whitfield standing 10 feet away, on his way back from the Connolly property, watching her with an expression she had not seen on him before. "Can you help me get him to Dr. Alderman?" she said. He was already moving. He picked Tommy up with a straightforward practicality that the boy seemed to find more reassuring than anything Frances had said, and they walked together to the doctor's office on Whitfield's long stride, Frances keeping pace, still holding the handkerchief against the wound. Dr. Alderman, a precise and irascible old man from Virginia, cleaned the cut and stitched it and told Tommy that he was fortunate, and that he should stop climbing things that were not meant to be climbed, which was advice Frances suspected would not be followed. When they came back out into the cold street, Gilbert fell into step beside her without discussion, as though it had been agreed upon, and they walked the length of 2 blocks before either of them said anything. "He'll be all right," Gilbert said. "He will," Frances agreed. Another block in silence. Then, without any particular build-up, he said, "Would you like to see my house?" She stopped walking. He stopped too and looked at her in the fading winter light, and there was something in his face that was entirely unguarded for just that moment, as though the question had surprised him as much as it had surprised her. "Yes," she said, "I would." He had a wagon. They drove out of town as the last light went purple over the plain, and the house appeared against the darkening sky as they came up the rise, a solid two-story structure with a covered porch, lit from inside by lamplight that came warm and yellow through the windows. He helped her down from the wagon without making a production of it, and then he stood for a moment looking at the house himself, and Frances had the sense that he was seeing it the way he always saw it when he came back to it, as a thing he had built with his own hands and was still a little astonished by. Inside, it was spare but not bleak. There was furniture he had made himself. She could see that, solid and well-jointed, without ornamentation but with a kind of functional elegance. A stone fireplace that was doing its work cheerfully. A kitchen that was clean in the way a man's kitchen is clean when he has no one to cook for, and so does not disorganize it. Books on a shelf more than she would have expected, their spines worn from handling. She looked at the books. He made coffee. They sat at the kitchen table, and this time the silence was different from the silences that had come before, not cautious but settled, like something finding its proper level. "You read a lot," she said. "In winter," he said, "not much else to do." "What do you read?" he considered. "History mostly, some philosophy, Walter Scott." "I had a teacher once who told me Scott was too romantic to be taken seriously, and I've been proving him wrong ever since." He said this with such straight-faced seriousness that it took her a moment to understand it was also a joke, and when she laughed he looked pleased in a way that was almost shy. They talked for 2 hours. Not about practical things, not about windows and weather and town business, but about real things, about books and the nature of the land, and what it meant to build something that lasted, and what her school was like when the children were engaged with something that genuinely lit them up, which she described with a specificity and enthusiasm that he listened to with complete attention. He told her about the years he had spent as a younger man working cattle drives up from South Texas, before he had saved enough to buy his own land, about the specific loneliness of the trail that was different from other kinds of loneliness, about what it was like to see the same stars for 6 weeks straight, until you felt you knew them personally. She did not ask about Clara, and he did not offer, and the absence of that conversation was not uncomfortable because they both understood it was there and could wait. When she said she should get back to town before the hour grew too late, he drove her back in the wagon, and they were both quiet on the return, but it was not the quiet of having nothing to say. It was the quiet of having said quite a lot and being content with it. At the door of the general store, she turned to face him in the cold night air. "Thank you," she said, meaning more than the coffee and the ride, meaning the 2 hours at the kitchen table that had been the most alive she had felt in longer than she could remember. He touched the brim of his hat. "Good night, Miss Thatcher." "Frances," she said, "if you prefer." He held her eyes for a moment. "Good night, Frances," he said, and drove away into the dark. She stood on the porch for a while after the wagon sound faded, listening to the quiet of the night, and she thought with some precision that she was in a significant amount of trouble. December moved through Calla Creek with the slow deliberation of a season that knows it has months still to run. Frances threw herself into the Christmas program at the school, which involved 12 children learning 3 songs and performing a reading of the Nativity, and which required a level of organizational effort that was not entirely unlike herding the very cattle Gilbert had described from his trail driving days. She was at the schoolhouse early and late. She was busy. She was occupied. She saw Gilbert twice a week, sometimes more, sometimes less. They were not courting, not formally, because nothing had been said that constituted a declaration of anything, but the shape of their interactions had changed in ways that were visible to everyone in Calla Creek who cared to look, and most of Calla Creek cared to look. He stopped by the general store twice with wood for Edith's stove, which was a practical errand that could not be objected to. He carried her things when their paths crossed, which happened more often than chance strictly accounted for. He came to the school Christmas program and sat in the back with his hat in his hands and watched the children sing with an expression that was complicated in ways she could not fully read from her position at the front of the room. She found him afterward, waiting outside in the cold while other parents collected their children, and she stood beside him for a moment and he said, "They sang well," and she said, "They did," and then neither of them said anything else for a moment until he said, "I have something for you," and produced from the pocket of his coat a small package wrapped in brown paper. She opened it. Inside was a book, a collected edition of George Eliot's essays, the spine slightly worn, which she understood meant it was from his own shelf. "I thought you might like it," he said. "She writes about education, about what it's for." She held the book with both hands and looked at him and felt something move in her chest that she was not prepared for. "Gilbert," she said, which was all she managed. "Merry Christmas, Frances," he said, and walked home. She read 4 essays that night sitting up by the lamp in her back room, and went to sleep thinking about a man who gave away books he had already read, because he thought you might need them more than he did. Christmas came and went with the particular warmth that small frontier communities manufactured for themselves out of not very much, communal dinners and hymn singing and children, whose excitement transformed even the plainest room. Frances spent Christmas Day with Edith Prout and a collection of Edith's relatives and neighbors, and it was warm and good, and she thought of Gilbert alone in his house on the north edge of the territory, and felt an ache that was specific and not at all vague. He had been invited to the Connolly Christmas. She learned from Margaret the following week, and had declined, which was, Margaret said with her particular tone, entirely typical. "He's not brooding," Margaret said, which had apparently become the thing she said when she felt the need to explain Gilbert's solitude. "He's just become accustomed to smallness," Frances said, remembering. "You told me." Margaret gave her a look that contained a significant quantity of meaning. "Then you understand what needs to happen." "I'm not in the business of rescuing anyone," Frances said, which was true. She had had that conversation with herself and was clear on the point. "No," Margaret agreed, "but you might be in the business of simply being present. Some people just need to know the door is open." Frances thought about that for a long time. She thought about it while she taught and while she read the George Eliot essays, and while she walked to and from the schoolhouse through the brittle January cold. She thought about it until it resolved itself into something manageable, which was this. She was not going to manage Gilbert Whitfield into anything, but she was not going to pretend either. She was going to be exactly what she was, honest and direct and present, and she was going to see what happened. January was very cold and very long and very beautiful. The creek froze over and the plains went white, and the sky was that particular shade of blue that only exists above snow. Gilbert came to town regularly on business, and their conversations lengthened and deepened, conducted sometimes on street corners with their breath fogging between them, and sometimes in the general store over Edith's counter, and twice at the schoolhouse, where he came to fix the stovepipe that had begun its habitual smoke leakage. He told her about the cattle business, about the economics of running a small ranch in territory that was being slowly transformed by the coming of barbed wire and the end of the open range, which he spoke about with the measured concern of a man who understands a thing is changing and has not yet decided how to change with it. She told him about her father in San Antonio, about the argument that had brought her here, about how her father had wanted her to marry the son of his business partner, and she had said no with a flatness that had ended the conversation and most of their relationship. She had not told anyone else in Calla Creek this story, and she was not entirely sure why she told it to Gilbert, except that he listened without filling the silence and without making her feel that she owed him an explanation for her choices. "Did you know him, the man your father wanted you to marry?" Gilbert asked. "I did," she said. He was pleasant enough. He was just not anything I wanted. What did you want? She looked at him directly. I haven't finished working that out, she said, which was the most honest answer she had, and she held his gaze when she said it in a way that meant she was not only talking about the man in San Antonio. He held her gaze for a moment and then looked away, and she saw the complicated thing that moved through him, the reaching and the pulling back, and she did not push at it because she had meant what she said to Margaret about not rescuing anyone. But she was not wrong about what she saw, and she knew she was not wrong, and she let that be enough for the time being. February arrived and brought with it a storm that kept half of Calla Creek indoors for 3 days. On the second day of the storm, Gilbert Whitfield sat at the kitchen table of his house with a piece of paper and a bottle of ink and his pen, and he began to write. He had not written a letter to anyone since Clara died. He had not written a letter that meant anything since he was 19 and working cattle and writing to his mother in Georgia, and those had been simple, dutiful letters with nothing much in them. What he was writing now was neither simple nor dutiful. It was the most difficult thing he had attempted in recent memory, more difficult than the timber framing of the Connolly barn, more difficult than the 3-year construction of his house, because those had been physical problems with physical solutions, and this was something else entirely. He was writing to Frances Thatcher. He sat for an hour and wrote half a page, and then read what he had written, and could not decide whether it was the truest thing he had ever set down or the most foolish. He set it aside and came back the next day and wrote more. He wrote about the way she had looked in the schoolhouse when she was explaining something to one of her students, the way her face changed when she talked about things she cared about, opening in a way that made you feel you were seeing something real. He wrote about the evening in January when she had told him about her father, and how the honesty of it had sat with him for days afterward, because he was not accustomed to people who said the thing they meant without trimming it into something more comfortable. He wrote about Clara, which was harder. He wrote about what it had been like to lose her and their daughter in the same winter, about the way grief had become, over time, not smaller but more familiar, something he carried with him the way you carry a permanent injury, always there, no longer debilitating but never entirely absent. He wrote about the house, about finishing it after they were gone, about how he had not known what to do with a finished house and a finished life that had had its future altered so completely. He wrote about learning to live small and the way smallness had felt, for a long time, like the only responsible choice, like something owed to the memory of what he had loved and lost. And then he wrote about her, about Frances, about the window frame and the kitchen table and the Christmas book and the long, slow conversations of January, and about how something that he had carefully put away inside himself had, without his permission, begun to reopen. He wrote it plainly, without ornamentation, in the direct sentences of a man who had never learned to dress things up and would not start now. He told her that he thought he was falling in love with her. He told her it frightened him in a way he did not know how to manage. He told her he did not know what to do with that information, and that he was writing it down because he could not yet find a way to say it, but that he wanted it to exist somewhere outside himself because carrying it alone was becoming more difficult than he had anticipated. He wrote for 3 months, not every day, not in great quantities, but steadily, returning to the letter the way you return to a wound that is healing, pressing at it to see how it is coming along. He added to it through February and March and into April. He wrote about specific things, about the afternoon in late February when he had seen her walking through the mud of the spring thaw with the full authority of a woman entirely at home in her own body, about the conversation in March when she had argued with him, actually argued, about the ethics of the railroad's relationship to the small rancher, and he had discovered that she was magnificent in disagreement, clear-eyed and formidable and entirely undeterred by the fact that he was bigger and louder than her. Not that he was particularly loud. He wrote about the Sunday in early April when he had found her reading on the general store's porch in the first warm sun of the year, her hair slightly undone from its pins, looking so completely herself that he had stood on the sidewalk across the street and simply looked for longer than was proper before she noticed him and waved. But he never sent it. Every time he considered sending it, he found a reason not to. The time was not right. He did not know how she felt. He did not want to impose his feelings on her like a burden she had not asked to carry. He did not know how to offer himself without also offering the grief and the house full of the absence of Clara and the smallness that Margaret Connolly had identified with such accuracy. He thought about what it would mean to hand her that letter and watch her read it, and the imagining of it was more than he could manage. So he folded it, 8 pages by the time it was finished, and he wrapped it in oilcloth against the damp, and he lifted the loose floorboard in the corner of his bedroom, the one near the window that he had never quite gotten around to fixing, and he put the letter underneath it, and he pressed the board back down, and he told himself he would decide what to do with it later. Later, in Gilbert Whitfield's experience, had a way of lasting longer than intended. What happened instead was spring, which came to Calla Creek with a generosity that the winter had seemed to promise. The creek ran full and the plains went green, and the cattle put on good weight, and the children in Frances's schoolhouse began to slip into that end-of-year restlessness that is the bane of teachers everywhere and that Frances managed with the judicious application of outdoor reading sessions and geography lessons that involved actually walking out to look at the land they were studying. And what happened was that the situation between Frances and Gilbert had arrived at a kind of equilibrium that was, by Frances's assessment, becoming intolerable. They were something. They had been something for months. Everyone in Calla Creek knew they were something. Margaret Connolly had taken to giving Frances knowing looks so frequently that Frances had been forced to tell her, on a Tuesday in March, to please stop looking at her like that. To which Margaret had said she would stop looking like that when there was something new to look at, which was the most Margaret Connolly sentence Frances had ever heard. The problem, as Frances understood it with increasing precision, was that Gilbert was waiting for ground he was sure of, and he was not yet sure, and she could not do the work of making him sure because she had already been as clear as she knew how to be without making a declaration that was, by the conventions of the time and place, not hers to make. She had said what she could say. She had been present in the ways that presence communicated itself. She had argued with him and laughed with him and sat in comfortable silence with him and told him things she told no one else. She did not know what more she could offer. She was thinking about this with some intensity on a Saturday in late April when she went to the Connolly ranch to return a book she had borrowed from Margaret. Robert Connolly was away on business and Margaret was in the garden and they had tea on the porch, and at some point Margaret said, with the directness that was her particular gift, "You need to go and see his house again." Frances looked at her. "I've seen his house." "Go and see it again," Margaret said. "There's something there you haven't seen yet." Frances wanted to ask what she meant, but Margaret had the look of a woman who has said exactly what she intended to say and not a word more. And Frances had learned, over the months of their friendship, that pressing Margaret rarely produced more information, only more certainty that the information given had been sufficient. It was not that instruction, precisely, that sent Frances to Gilbert's property on a Sunday in early May. It was something simpler than that, which was that she had made a decision. She had spent the winter being patient, and the spring being patient, and she was a woman who had walked out of her father's house with a carpet bag and come to Calla Creek on the back of a mail wagon, and she knew how to do hard things. She was going to tell him that she would like to know what this was. She was going to say it plainly and accept whatever he said in return. She drove Edith's small wagon out to the north edge of the territory on a Sunday afternoon when the sky was enormous and the grass was the particular green of early May. The house was just as she remembered it, square and solid against the sky, and Gilbert was in the yard when she arrived, working at something near the fence line, and he came forward when he saw her with an expression that was surprised but not unwelcoming. "Frances," he said. "I thought I'd come and see how the place is looking in spring," she said, which was both true and not entirely the point. He showed her around, outside first, the barn and the pasture where the cattle moved in the good grass, then the garden plot he had started, which was modest but promising, then inside, the house, which was essentially as she remembered it, except that the light was different in spring, warm and golden through the windows, and the rooms felt less spare than they had in the winter dark. She was standing in the kitchen when she said, "Gilbert, I want to ask you something." He turned from where he was filling the coffee pot at the basin. His expression was still in the way of a man bracing himself. "I want to know," she said, "what it is that you think we are." The stillness deepened. Then he set the coffee pot down very carefully, as though it were fragile. "That's a direct question," he said. "I've been direct with you from the beginning," she said. "I'm not going to stop now." He turned to face her fully. The kitchen was quiet around them. Outside, through the window, the plains stretched away to the horizon in their May morning green, and a mockingbird was doing something elaborate and self-satisfied in the cedar by the porch. "I think," he said slowly, "that you are the most extraordinary person I have met in a very long time." He stopped, started again. "And I think that I am—" He stopped again, and she watched him work at it, watched the careful man try to find the ground firm enough to stand on. "Gilbert," she said, "I am not made of glass. You are not going to break anything by saying it." He looked at her with something that was close to desperation. "I wrote you a letter," he said abruptly, "months ago. I've been writing it since February. I never sent it." She stared at him. "You wrote me a letter." 8 pages, he said, "give or take." She absorbed this. "Where is it?" He was quiet for a moment. "Under the floorboard," he said. "In the bedroom, the loose one near the window." She looked at him. He looked at her. The mockingbird hit a particularly extravagant note outside. "Can I read it?" she asked. Everything in his face underwent a significant rearrangement. "I wrote it," he said, "so that it could exist somewhere outside me. I told myself I was waiting until I knew what to do with it." He was silent for a moment. "I think I've been waiting to know whether—" He stopped. "Whether what?" "Whether I could be enough," he said. "After everything. Whether a man who has already—" He stopped again. And she saw it. The specific thing he carried, not grief alone, but the fear that grief had reduced him somehow, had made him less capable of the thing he was trying to speak toward. She crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and took his face in her hands, which she had never done before and which startled him visibly, and she said, very clearly, "Gilbert Whitfield, you are the most sufficient man I have ever met, and I would very much like to read your letter." He exhaled. It was not quite a laugh and not quite a sigh, but it was the sound of something releasing that had been held for a long time. "Come on, then," he said. They went to the bedroom, which was clean and spare, with his books on a shelf above the bed, and the loose floorboard in the corner near the window exactly where he had said it was. He knelt and lifted it, and the letter was there in its oilcloth wrapping, slightly yellowed at the edges but intact. He handed it to her without looking at her face, which told her everything about how much it cost him. She sat on the edge of his bed and unwrapped the oilcloth and unfolded the pages. 8 pages, as he had said, in his handwriting, which was careful and slightly cramped, the handwriting of a man who had taught himself to write from reading and not from much formal instruction. She read it in silence while he stood by the window, looking out at the yard, his hands at his sides. She read for a long time. The letter was, as she read it, the most honest document she had ever held. It was not eloquent in a literary sense, but it was precise and true in the way that things written without an audience in mind are sometimes precisely true. She read his account of grief and smallness and the house built for a life that had not survived, and she felt the ache of it without pity, because it was not pitiable, it was simply real. She read his account of watching her and knowing her, and the slow and inadvertent opening of something he had carefully closed, and she felt that she was receiving something of tremendous weight and care. She reached the last page, read his final sentences, which were plain and direct and devastating in their plainness, and she lowered the letter to her lap and looked up at him. "You wrote this in February," she said. "I started in February," he said, still looking out the window. "And you finished it in April." "Yes. And you were going to just leave it under the floorboard." He turned from the window. His face was open in a way she had not seen before, the careful man's careful defenses entirely down. "I didn't know what to do with it," he said. "I still don't, honestly, except—" He stopped. "Except that I found it," she said, though that was not precisely true. "You showed it to me." "I told you it was there," he said, which was not exactly a correction but was a distinction. "You told me it was there," she agreed. "After 8 pages and 3 months. I'm a slow man," he said, and the wry honesty of it made her laugh, a proper laugh that filled the quiet bedroom, and she saw his expression change in response to it, soften in a way that was not soft but was the opposite of closed. She folded the letter carefully and held it. "Gilbert," she said, "every single thing you wrote in here. You know I feel it too." He was very still. "I have felt it since November," she said. "Since the night you showed me this house the first time, when you said you were proud that it stands, and I thought that was the most honest thing anyone had said to me in years." She paused. "You have not been carrying this alone. You have been carrying it alone unnecessarily, which is a distinction." He crossed the room and stood in front of her, and she looked up at him from her seat on the edge of the bed with the letter in her hands, and what she saw in his face was something arriving, something that had been a long time coming and was finally here. "Frances," he said, "I would like to court you properly, if you'll let me." "Gilbert," she said. "I have been waiting for you to say that for approximately 4 months." He sat down beside her on the edge of the bed, and they were quiet together for a moment in the spring afternoon light, and then he said, "I'm sorry I took so long," with a sincerity that was almost painful. "You showed me the letter," she said. "You just needed a little help getting it to the right place. Is that what that was?" "That's what that was," she said, and she took his hand, which was rough and large and warm, and he held hers with the same carefulness he applied to everything, like he knew the value of what he was holding. The courtship of Frances Thatcher and Gilbert Whitfield was conducted with the full and enthusiastic awareness of everyone in Calla Creek, because there was no possibility of conducting anything in that town with anything less than the full awareness of everyone. Edith Prout was pleased. Margaret Connolly was gratified. The Connolly Ranch cook, Mrs. Olathe, declared it about time, which became something of a catchphrase. What it looked like, day to day, was not dramatically different from what had come before, because the shape of their relationship had already established itself. They walked together in the evenings, after the school day and the work day were done, through the greening town and out along the creek road. They had Sunday dinners at Edith's and at the Connolly Ranch, and occasionally at the homes of other families who were not subtle about the welcome they extended. He came to the schoolhouse when he could and fixed the things that needed fixing, which were several, because schoolhouses always needed fixing, and she brought him food she had made in Edith's kitchen, because she had discovered that she liked to cook for someone who ate with genuine appreciation. She also kept the letter. She had folded it back into its oilcloth wrapping and had taken it with her when she left his house that Sunday afternoon, not as a trophy but as a thing that had cost him greatly and that she therefore treated with care. She kept it in her mother's Bible. He saw her reading it once on the store porch in June, and he turned slightly red in a way that was completely at odds with his general composure, and she looked up and said, without any attempt at tact, "It's very good, you know. You write well." "I write plainly," he said. "That's the same thing," she said. "Most people confuse decoration with quality." He sat down beside her and looked at the letter in her hands and said, "I can't believe you're reading that in public." "The oilcloth is still on the outside," she said. "No one knows what it is." "I know what it is." "I know," she said, and smiled at him, and he shook his head and looked away and was not able to conceal the fact that he was smiling too. July was hot in the way of Texas Julys, which was specific and uncompromising. The plains baked and the cattle moved slowly in the heat, and the children in the schoolhouse sat in states of glazed endurance that Frances managed by opening all the windows and switching to the least vigorous forms of instruction she could justify. She was planning to leave the following September, or so had been her original arrangement. The schoolteacher post had been offered for 1 year, and the question of what came next had been abstract for many months, but was becoming less abstract with speed. She did not raise the subject because it seemed to her that there was an order to things, and she had already done enough of the raising. But it was Margaret Connolly who mentioned it, in the way that Margaret Connolly mentioned most things, which was directly and without much preamble. "Your year is up in October," Margaret said in late July. "It is," Frances agreed. "What does Gilbert say about it?" "We haven't discussed it," Frances said, which was true and which she was beginning to find genuinely frustrating. Margaret gave her a look. "You should discuss it." "I'm aware," Frances said. "He'll wait forever to bring it up," Margaret said. "He thinks it's not his place or some such notion. He's very principled about not presuming." "I know," Frances said. "It's one of the things I admire about him, and it is, at this moment, extremely inconvenient." Margaret laughed, which she did freely when Frances said things like this. "Tell him," she said. "Tell him what you want." She told him on a Thursday evening in August, sitting on his porch in the particular thick warmth of a summer evening in Calla Creek, with the stars coming out above the plains in their endless profusion, and the cattle making sounds in the distance, and the crickets doing what crickets do in August, which is announce themselves without apology. She had not planned precisely what she was going to say. She found with Gilbert that planning rarely improved things. "My year is up in October," she said. He was quiet. She felt him become very still beside her in the way that he did when something significant was requiring his attention. "I know," he said. "I need to know," she said, "whether I have a reason to stay." He was quiet for longer this time. She waited. The crickets continued. "Frances," he said. "Gilbert," she said. "I want to marry you," he said. The words came out with the same plainness as everything he said, direct and unadorned, and she felt them land in her chest with a solidity that was like something she had been waiting to pick up. She turned to look at him in the dark. "That's a reason to stay," she said. "I was working up to it," he said, and there was something in his voice that was slightly defensive and slightly self-aware and entirely him, and she loved it completely. "You were working up to it," she said. "How long were you planning to work up to it?" "Longer than this," he admitted. "You're very impatient." "I waited 4 months for you to say you wanted to court me," she said. "I have been enormously patient." "You have," he said, and his voice had changed, the slight defensiveness gone, something warmer and more real in its place. "You have been very patient, more patient than I deserved." "You deserved it," she said. "You were worth waiting for. I just needed you to know that October exists." He reached over and took her hand in the dark, with the care he always used, and said, "Will you marry me, Frances Thatcher?" "Yes," she said, immediately, without hesitation, and felt the answer settle into the warm evening air with the finality of something properly concluded. "Yes, I will." He raised her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles in a gesture that was simultaneously formal and entirely intimate, and she looked at his dark head bent over her hand in the starlight and felt something move through her that was warm and deep and entirely new in its specific quality, different from everything that had come before it. "Good," he said quietly against her hand. "Good." They were married in October of 1883 at the Calla Creek church, which was full to overflowing with every person in the territory who considered themselves connected to either of them, which was most of the territory. Frances wore her good dress, which Edith Prout had spent 2 weeks helping her alter and add to, until it was something properly bridal, cream-colored with small blue flowers at the collar that Edith had produced from somewhere, and attached with the precision of a woman who had been waiting for this particular project. Gilbert wore a suit that was new and slightly uncomfortable, and that he bore with the stoic dignity of a man who understands some discomfort is the price of things worth having. Margaret Connolly cried, which was unexpected and which she denied afterward. Edith Prout did not cry but looked so pleased that it was roughly equivalent. The Connolly children threw flower petals from the garden. Tommy Prout, who had healed perfectly from his creekbed gash and was now 15 and Frances's most advanced student, sat in the front row with his family and looked at the whole proceeding with the expression of someone very young, who is in the presence of something they will remember forever. The minister, a young man from Tennessee named Reverend Cates, who had been in Calla Creek 8 months and was still slightly stunned by it, read the vows with evident sincerity. When he reached the part where Gilbert was to say his vow, Gilbert said it with his eyes on Frances's face and his voice even and clear, not performing anything, just saying the true thing, and the church was entirely quiet for the 2 seconds after he finished, which were the loudest 2 seconds Frances had ever experienced. She said her own vows with equal evenness, and she felt, as she said them, the full weight of what they were, promises made in the presence of everyone she had come to love in this place she had chosen, and she did not find the weight oppressive but rather exactly right, the kind of weight that tells you the foundation is solid. Gilbert kissed her with his hands on her face and the whole church erupted, which startled him slightly and made her laugh, and Reverend Cates said something that was lost under the noise, and it was perfect. The reception was held at the Connolly Ranch, because Margaret Connolly had insisted, and Margaret Connolly was not someone you successfully resisted. There was food enough for twice the company and fiddle music from a man named Jenkins who had traveled 12 miles specifically for the occasion, and dancing in the Connolly barn that lasted until the moon was high, and Frances danced with her husband, which was a thing she had not done before and turned out to be an experience of considerable joy, because Gilbert Whitfield danced with the same careful competence he brought to everything and held her close enough that she could feel his heartbeat. Happy. He asked her over the fiddle. Exceedingly, she said. He turned her in the dance, smooth and sure, and said against her hair, good. They drove out to his house, their house now, in the warm October night, and the plains were silver under the moon, and the stars were their usual extravagant selves, and Frances leaned against his shoulder on the wagon seat, and he drove with one hand, which she had not seen him do before, the other arm around her, and she thought that she had come to Calla Creek on a mail wagon with a carpetbag and no certainty about anything, and she was going home. Home was the house he had built with his own hands, and it stood for them now. And when they came in and lit the lamps, the light fell warm and golden over everything. And Frances stood in the kitchen that was now her kitchen too, and looked at the house that was now her house too, and felt something settle in her that had not been settled for a very long time. She found the loose floorboard herself, a week after they were married. She had been cleaning and had lifted the board without knowing its history, and found nothing there, of course, because she still had the letter in her mother's Bible on the shelf, but the sight of the space under the board made something come up in her throat that was entirely unexpected. She went and got the letter from the Bible and came back to the bedroom and stood by the window with it. Gilbert appeared in the doorway and saw what she was holding and went very still. I keep thinking about this, she said, not accusingly, looking at the folded pages. 3 months. You wrote it for 3 months and you were going to leave it here. I was trying to work it out, he said. I know, she said. I know you were. She looked at him across the room. I'm glad you told me it was there. I'm glad I could read it. But Gilbert, she paused. You don't have to work things out alone anymore. That's done now. Whatever is in here, she held up the letter. You can say it to me. He crossed the room and stood before her and took the letter from her gently and looked at it for a moment, then set it on the windowsill. I'm still learning that, he said. I know, she said. I'll be patient. You'll be impatient, he said, and the ghost of a smile was there. I'll be patient for approximately 4 months, she said, and then I'll be impatient. That's my current record. He laughed, a real laugh, the kind that she had been working toward since November of last year and had been hearing with increasing frequency, and it filled the bedroom and went out through the window into the October morning. He took her face in his hands, mirroring what she had done to him in this same room in May, and he said, I love you, Frances Whitfield, with the same plainness and directness of everything he said, and she felt it hit her full and clear and solid. I love you, Gilbert Whitfield, she said. I have for quite some time. "I know," he said, "you're not difficult to read." "And you are impossible to read," she said. "That's changing," he said. "It is," she agreed. "I can confirm." He kissed her there by the window of the bedroom in their house that stood, and the morning light came in gold and clean over the Texas plains, and the loose floorboard lay empty in the corner, its work done. The years that followed had the quality of things built properly, steady and strong and capable of holding what was put in them. The schoolhouse in Calla Creek went to a new teacher in November of 1883, a young man fresh from a college in Tennessee who arrived with a great deal of theory and not very much practice, and who Frances took quietly under her wing in the way that experienced teachers do, visiting occasionally with suggestions delivered as questions, because that was how you kept a young man's pride intact while improving his methods. She and Gilbert settled into the rhythms of the ranch life and the town life and the particular partnership that they were, which was unlike most partnerships she had observed in Calla Creek in that it involved a great deal of conversation. He came home in the evenings, and she asked him about his day, and he told her, in his particular careful and eventually complete way, about the cattle and the fence repairs and the carpentry work he still took on in town. And she told him about the bread she had finally gotten right on the third try, and the letter from her former student Emily, who had gone to school in Austin, and the argument she had won in her head against a position her father had taken in a letter he had sent in November. She was reconciling with her father, slowly and by correspondence, because she had decided it was right, and also because she thought Gilbert had made it easier for her to understand men who are not fluent in what they feel, and she was more charitable toward her father for having come to know Gilbert, which she found she could tell her father in a letter in March, and which prompted a response from him that was the most honest thing he had written to her in years. The winter of 1884 was a mild one. The spring was good. The cattle came through strong and Gilbert sold well at market, and they put money aside with the seriousness of people building something for the future, not just surviving the present. Frances discovered, in May of 1884, that she was carrying their first child. She told him on a Friday evening on the porch in the last light of the day, as directly as she told him everything. He did not speak for a moment. She watched his face and saw the journey it made, from surprise through something complex and private, and then into something that was, by the time it arrived, unmistakably joy. He looked at her, and his eyes were bright in a way she had not seen before. "Frances," he said. "I know," she said. He reached for her, and she came into his arms, and he held her with a completeness that was new and that she recognized as something more than happiness, something that had to do with all the years before and the things that had been taken and the not knowing whether there was more ahead. "Are you frightened?" she asked against his shoulder. "Yes," he said immediately and honestly. "Good," she said. "So am I. We'll be frightened together." "That's your answer to everything," he said. "It's worked so far," she said. Their son was born on the 3rd of December, 1884, a healthy boy of reasonable size who arrived in the world with considerable noise, and then fell asleep with the abruptness of someone who has completed an enormous task. They named him James, for Gilbert's father, who had died when Gilbert was young, and whose name he had carried with him across the years in the particular way that names carry the dead. Gilbert held the baby with the careful large hands that were accustomed to building and repairing, and his face was entirely unmistakable, entirely open, entirely present. He looked at his son and then at Frances and said, "He's perfect," with the conviction of a man who has no doubt about this. "He looks like you," Frances said. "God help him," Gilbert said, and she laughed, which woke the baby, who resumed his earlier noise policy, and it was the best noise in the world. Edith Prout came to see the baby the first week and declared him excellent. Margaret Connolly came with a basket of food large enough to last a fortnight, and stood by the cradle, and was the specific kind of quiet that people are when they are in the presence of something they find genuinely moving. Robert Connolly, who was not a demonstrative man, shook Gilbert's hand with both of his and said, "Well done, son," which was more than he said to most people. Tommy Prout, who was now 16 and beginning to think about what he would do with his life, came by on a Sunday afternoon and looked at James with the solemn expression of a young person confronting the fact of a new human being, and then said to Frances, with characteristic earnestness, "He's going to be the smartest kid in your class in about 6 years, Miss Frances." And Frances said, "Mrs. Whitfield, Tommy," and Tommy went red and said, "Right, sorry, Mrs. Whitfield." And she found it entirely endearing. The years arranged themselves. James grew with the systematic determination of children, adding length and words and opinions at a rate that seemed designed to keep his parents perpetually readjusting to who he had become. He was a serious child with his father's deliberateness and his mother's directness, which meant that by the time he was 3, he was conducting conversations that required some preparation. Frances continued to be involved in the school, informally, sitting on the school board when it was established in 1886, and advocating with persistence for longer school terms and better materials, which she obtained through a combination of argument and charm that was her specific variety of persuasion. She also taught privately, several of the ranch children who could not make it to school regularly, coming out to outlying properties on Saturdays with her books and her methods, because she had never been able to stop teaching any more than she could have stopped breathing. Gilbert's ranch grew steadily. He added acreage in 1885 and more cattle and a second barn, and he took on a hand named Peter Reyes, who was 22 and from a Mexican family in the south of the territory, and who was an excellent worker and a quiet man whose company Gilbert appreciated, and who Frances fed at their table with the same matter-of-factness with which she did everything, because to her there was no question about it. There were injustices in the territory that Frances did not look away from, the way that some in Calla Creek looked away. The land was still being contested in ways that disadvantaged those who had been there longest, and the law was not always equally applied, and she spoke about these things when she was in a position to speak, at school board meetings and town councils, and in conversations with men like Robert Connolly who had the influence to effect something. She was not always heard. She was heard sometimes, which was enough to keep her speaking. Gilbert supported her in this without reservation, because it was consistent with who she was and he had married who she was specifically, and because his own sense of fairness was simple and firm and extended to people who did not always receive it. In the spring of 1887, Frances found that she was expecting again. She told Gilbert on a Thursday evening in February, and this time he did not need a moment to arrive at joy. He was there immediately, taking both her hands and looking at her with an expression that was warm and certain and entirely without ambiguity. "Good," he said, which was his word for things that were right. Their daughter was born in September of 1887, small and fierce, and very certain about her opinions from the first hours. They named her Clara, which they had discussed once and then not again, and the name was given and received and settled into the house and made its home there, and it felt right. It felt like the right way to carry a name that deserved to live. Gilbert held Clara in the hours after she was born, standing by the window of the bedroom, the same window with the loose floorboard below it, and Frances watched him with the specific exhaustion of a woman who has just done something enormous, and the specific contentment of a woman watching the person she loves hold the thing they have made together. And she thought about the letter under the floorboard and the 3 months it had taken him to write it, and the morning she had found it, and the whole long, careful arc of 2 people making their way to each other. "You're going to talk to her," Frances said from the bed. He looked at her. "Every time you hold James you talk to him," she said. "You should talk to her." He looked down at his daughter and said, very quietly, in the voice he used for things that mattered, "Hello, Clara," and the baby opened her eyes and appeared to consider him with the full gravity of someone conducting an assessment, and Gilbert's face was everything. "James," at 3 years old, was brought in to see his sister and greeted her with the seriousness of a child taking on a significant responsibility. He said, "She's very small," which was accurate, and then said, "Is she going to stay?" And Gilbert said, "Yes, she's going to stay." And James considered this and nodded and accepted it as settled. She was going to stay. They were all going to stay. This was their life. The house that stood and the plains that stretched away and the children who grew and the school board meetings and the Sunday dinners at Edith's and the evenings on the porch when the stars came out in their extravagance. And Gilbert sat beside her with his arm around her shoulders, and they talked or were quiet with equal comfort. In 1889, a man from a newspaper in Dallas came through Calla Creek writing a piece about small ranching communities and the way of life of the frontier, and he sat down with Gilbert and Frances together, which he had not expected to do, but which became the more interesting interview for it. And he asked them how they had come to be here and what they thought of it. Gilbert said, as he always said, something measured and true about the land and the work. Frances said that she had come on a mail wagon with a carpetbag in 1882 and had found everything she was looking for, though not in the order or form she had expected. The reporter looked between them. "And you?" he said to Gilbert. "What did you find?" Gilbert looked at Frances. She looked back. It was a look they had been practicing for 7 years, and it had, by now, an enormous amount in it. "I found," Gilbert said in his even plain voice, "that the things worth having are mostly the things you didn't know you needed." The reporter wrote that down and used it in his piece, attributing it to a cattle rancher and carpenter in Calla Creek, Texas, which was accurate enough. In 1890, they planted a garden together that was considerably larger and more ambitious than the one Gilbert had started alone, because Frances had decided they should grow more of their own food, and had thrown herself into this project with the same systematic energy. She applied to everything, and the garden was magnificent that first year, and James helped with the planting with the seriousness of a 6-year-old taking on real work, and Clara, at 2.5, helped by removing certain plants from the ground and presenting them to whoever was nearest with an expression of considerable satisfaction. Edith Pruitt's health had declined since 1888, gradually but perceptibly, and Frances had taken to spending more time at the store, helping with the books and the ordering, which Edith accepted with the gracious practicality of a woman who knew what she needed and did not diminish herself by refusing it. She died in the winter of 1891, in her sleep, which was the right way for someone like Edith to go, quiet and without fuss, having done exactly what she intended with her life. She left the store to her nephew in San Antonio and a small sum to Frances, with a note that said simply, "You were exactly who we needed," which Frances kept in her mother's Bible with the letter. The letter lived there still, in its oilcloth wrapping, among the pages of the Bible. Frances had read it perhaps a dozen times over the years, not out of any unresolved feeling, but because it was extraordinary, because it was the truest account of a man arriving at love that she had ever encountered, and because she thought that some things deserved to be read more than once. She had never hidden the fact that she kept it. Gilbert knew, and had long since made his peace with it, had reached the point where he occasionally said, when she seemed to be thinking about something, "Are you reading the letter again in your head?" was his version of teasing, and which made her laugh every time without exception. "You should write another one," she told him once in 1891, sitting up by the lamp while the children slept. He looked at her over the book he was reading. "Another letter. You were good at it," she said. "You write well. You said it yourself. You think in winter when there's not much else to do." "I think I've managed to say the things I need to say," he said with a faint dryness. "You've improved," she conceded. Dramatically. "I had a good teacher," he said, and went back to his book. And she looked at him in the lamplight and thought, as she thought on regular occasions, that she had done exactly right by coming to Calla Creek on a mail wagon with a carpetbag and $3 and a stubbornness her mother had called enough to break stone. She had found a window frame and a kitchen table and 8 pages of handwriting, and a man who built things that stood and was proud of that. And she was proud of it too, proud of all of it, proud of the house and the children and the years and the garden, and the particular ordinary, extraordinary life that two careful people who loved each other could build when they finally stopped working up to it. The spring of 1892 was the most beautiful spring Frances could remember in Calla Creek, and she had been there 10 years by then and had a good frame of reference. The grass came in thick and early, and the creek ran high, and the blossoms on the peach tree Gilbert had planted in the garden the previous year came out white and abundant, and then fell in a snow of petals that covered the ground around it. James was 7, and going to school with the same focused seriousness with which he did everything. His mother's son in this, and his father's son in his carpenter's interest in how things were put together. He had begun, under Gilbert's patient supervision, to learn the rudiments of woodworking, and the things he made were rough but genuinely earnest, small boxes and badly jointed stools that Gilbert displayed with the particular pride of a man who understands that what matters is the beginning. Clara was 4 and was, by universal agreement, the most certain person in Calla Creek. She had opinions about everything. She had opinions about breakfast. She expressed these opinions clearly and without apology, and then reconsidered them in the light of new evidence, which Frances found to be the exact right approach and told her so. On a morning in late April, Frances sat on the porch with her coffee while Gilbert worked in the yard, and the children played somewhere around the side of the house, and the plains stretched away in their green and gold immensity, and she thought about the woman who had come to this place a decade ago with nothing much and the life she had built here, and the man she had built it with. Gilbert came to the porch and sat beside her in the morning light, bringing his own coffee, and they were quiet together in the way they were always quiet together, which was the comfortable quiet of people who have said most of the things and know the rest can wait. "What are you thinking?" he asked after a while. "About 10 years ago," she said, "when I arrived." "On the mail wagon," he said. "On the mail wagon," she confirmed. He was quiet for a moment. "Were you scared, terrified?" she said. "I didn't have any idea what I was doing." "You seemed very sure of yourself," he said. "I've always seemed sure of myself," she said. "It's one of my better performances." He smiled. She could see it in profile, the particular quiet smile that was his best one. "I'm glad you came," he said. "On the mail wagon." "I know you are," she said. "I'm glad too." He reached over without looking at her and found her hand on the arm of the chair and took it in his, the familiar careful grip, and she turned her hand and held his back, and they sat like that in the April morning with the sun warm on the porch and the plains going gold at the edges and the children's voices from around the side of the house. "We should fix that floorboard," he said after a while. She turned to look at him. "The loose one." "It's been loose since before we were married," he said. "That's embarrassing for a carpenter." "Leave it," she said. He looked at her. "Leave it," she said again. "Some things deserve to stay as they are." He held her eyes for a moment and then nodded and looked back at the plains. "All right," he said. The loose floorboard stayed. The letter stayed in her mother's Bible. The house stood, square and solid and true, on the north edge of Calla Creek, Texas, as it had stood since a man who built things carefully and loved with the same care had raised it from the ground in the years before Frances Thatcher came to town on a mail wagon with a carpetbag and $3 and found him. And what they had built together in the years since was better and stronger and more alive than anything either of them had imagined on the separate roads that had brought them to the same place at the same moment in 1882. And it stood, and they were proud that it stood, and it was more than enough. It was everything.